You just finished documenting your process and you're thinking to yourself, is there anything else I need before I start doing my analysis? And the answer is yes, we will need data as well. Hi everyone, I'm Sheila Shaffie and welcome back to another episode by ProcessArc. In today's video, we're going to talk about the types of data you're going to need or should collect as additional dimensions to your process map in order to add the required dimensions or colors or context that you're going to need in order to do a really good job of understanding what's really happening in your business. If you like ideas like this, process analysis, innovation, and critical thinking, please don't forget to subscribe. So we'll talk about 4 major topics. What are the data points I should be collecting and considering as part of my process documentation? Where do I get them from? I will take you through an example of the data that we're going to be talking about. And then the last item are some nice to have items to collect if you can get your hands on it. Now, there's a tremendous amount of content and information around how to mechanically go about building the process map. There are videos around software, what kind of software you should use. There's a lot of material around, should I be using a box or a square or a diamond in order to physically document my process? How deep do I go in my process analysis? What kind of content do I capture in each of those boxes and diamonds? And those are all fantastic content that is going to help and enable you into physically documenting the process from its beginning to its end. But that's not really all that we're going to need in order to do a really nice job of analyzing what's happening in the process and where attention is needed. So if we just stop the process mapping exercise to where we finish documenting the current state of the process, what is probably going to end up happening is that it's going to end up in a binder on someone's shelf, and it's just going to be a really nice, pretty picture. And to save ourselves that heartache, because it's not easy to document a process, let's talk about exactly what data points we should be collecting. And I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible, keeping the ideas to the core and fundamental data points that it would be wonderful if you could collect. And those 5 data points are cycle time, rework, touch time, head count, and percent conversion. Now the next question is, how do I actually collect these data points? Now, the easiest way is if you could actually get some of the data, particularly percent rework, touch time, and cycle time out of your systems. So if there is a workflow system that captures particular timestamps, it would be fantastic to get those data points out in order to do your analysis. If you don't have that luxury of being able to go into a workflow system, there are no particular and accurate timestamps, you could be collecting all of those data points, cycle time, rework, touch time, head count, even percent conversion, as you are interviewing the subject matter experts and trying to understand what's going on. At any point in time, you can stop the conversation or pivot the conversation to, well, how long does this actually take you? How often do you have to wait for material to come to you in order to finish your processing step? How often do you stop because you don't have accurate information? Those types of questions allow you to capture the numbers around the performance of a process. Now, I've done videos around how to specifically calculate each of these metrics, and I will put a tag above. So if you want to learn about how do you physically, mathematically calculate percent rework or cycle time or touch time or percent conversion, all of those calculations I've outlined in earlier videos, so feel free to watch them. Now, once you've actually compiled all of this data, you can start doing the analysis. But before we do that, let me take you through an example of physically what I mean when I'm talking about cycle time, touch time, rework, head count, and percent conversion. Let's get to the example. Here's our process map. And I've kept it at a very high level because the intent of this example is not to necessarily show you how to do process documentation, but rather how and what data you need to be compiling in order to do your analysis. Because again, remember, a process map without any data is just a pretty picture that's not going to enable you to really understand what needs to be fixed or why issues are persisting in the business. So you quickly will see a couple of data points that I've plopped on to the map, and this is a process map that you may have seen in previous videos. It has to do with onboarding a new customer. So there are applications being submitted, reviewed, and then data is being inputted into the process for the underwriters or whoever may be to begin to review the application to make a decision. So first off, you'll see this notion of a ... here, and that all that means is that there are additional steps that I'm simply just not showing you. So all I'm showing you where it is essentially where the process is starting, and the last step, excuse me, where the process is ending. So there's lots of things that happen in between, but again, the intent is not to show you how to do process documentation. The data points that you're seeing are essentially the total number of volume that's coming in, the total number of volume that's leaving the process in a particular time frame, let's say in a day, and we have only one inspection point, which is this diamond here, and the probability of something not being accepted, or essentially in this situation not being considered in good order, being 30%. So let's talk about very quickly, how do you actually use some of these data points? I'm not going to go through the interpretation of the data, but just how are you going to use this data, and what are some of the definitions of the data that I'm showing you? One of the easiest and quickest things that you could do if you have input volume and output volume in your process map is to consider calculating percent conversion. To calculate percent conversion, essentially mathematically, is how much came out of the process, your output, divided by the amount you put into the process, which is input, multiplied by 100%. So in our situation, we had 50 applications that were processed successfully in a given day, but we had put in 100 applications at the start of the day for it to be processed, multiplied by 100%, gives us a conversion rate of 50%. So what does this technically mean? It means that a probability of us being able to complete an application correctly and perfectly in a given day is 50%, which means the other 50% are getting clogged up somewhere in the process. That is an indication of inefficiency right off the bat. I've done an entire video on how to calculate percent conversion of a process, so make sure you go back and look into it. I'll leave a tag for percent conversion. Another way to interpret percent conversion, if you're thinking about it from a sales perspective, or if you're analyzing a sales process, is saying, I've done 100 proposals for a customer in a given month, only 50 of them have decided to proceed with us. That is also an indication of leakage. So essentially it's an indication of how many customers have decided not to do business with you for whatever reason it may be. If we go to the next slide, this is kind of the meat of what we've been talking about in the video, which is what are some of the key data elements to collect when you're thinking about process analysis. You will certainly need to collect cycle time, touch time, the total volume being processed in a given step, if there is a rework associated with a step, and the amount of headcount. Now, you may not be able to get all of these data points for every single step, and that's okay. I don't want you to put a lot of stress on yourself that I have to complete and compile all of these data points. It would be fantastic if you could. And remember, some of these data points like touch time and cycle time and rework even can be collected anecdotally from the person, the subject matter expert that you're interviewing, if you don't have timestamps in your system. So do your best in compiling as much as you can. The more you have, the clearer a picture you will have as to where the process issues are persisting in your company. So if you remember cycle time from previous videos, cycle time is calculated from a moment that a process starts to the moment that it is finished and ready for the next step to pick up that work, to start working on it. So in this situation, notice how I've included the inspection point in that process step or in that cycle time, because technically this milestone, receive and review the new customer application, is not finished until we can start inputting the data into our core system. So this inspection point needs to be included. Now, notice how the cycle time is 3 days. So from the time that we receive an application to the time that we can input the data into the system takes 3 days. Now, Some of you may have guessed already why that may be. The biggest driver of the cycle time has to do with this inspection point. When you have inspection points, and in this situation, when roughly 30% of the applications coming in are considered not in good order, that just elongates your cycle time. I'll explain a little bit more in a few seconds. Now, notice that the touch time is 5 minutes. Touch time essentially is the amount of time that you're physically doing the work, physically opening up the file, reviewing the application, looking to see what's there and what's not there. That takes an individual 5 minutes. The difference between cycle time and touch time, the difference between cycle time and touch time is the wait time. And the wait time is what kills the response time or the speed of a process. So the more you have to wait for things to get done, the slower that process is going to perform. And so this is why I always tell my team, don't just look at cycle time. Cycle time is great. It's good to understand how long a process step takes, but the touch time gives us the additional dimension to have in order to figure out if there's a lot of waiting happening in that step or in that milestone in the process. Now let's go to the next one, which is total volume. Now notice the total volume is no longer just 100, because why? We put in 100, 30% of them get rejected and have to get reworked at some point in time. So this team that's actually receiving and reviewing a new customer application is actually reviewing 130 apps. They review the first 100, 30 get kicked back, that 30 comes in with the next 100. So you've got this perpetual loop of 130 applications that are being processed by this one team. And that's again important to understand, because the higher your rework rate, the higher your rejection when you do a review of something, the more you have to reprocess that same work. And again, that creates bottlenecks. Next element is percent rework, which we've highlighted right up here. Again, it's the probability when you're doing an inspection of finding a defect, an error, or something that's considered NIGO, not in good order. And the last element, of course, is headcount. How many people are physically doing this step? All of these data points, again, are important, one on their own, but also to create a baseline to relate one step to another. Is 10 people enough to do this step or not? Well, you don't know that until you can relate it to the other steps. And here's what I'm talking about. We looked at the next milestone, which is to input the application data into the system and submit it to underwriting. So now everything is considered in good order. I can proceed. I've got, again, cycle time, touch time, total volume, rework rate, and headcount. Notice here that the cycle time and touch time are incredibly close in nature, because why? I'm not inspecting for anything. There's no rework there. So the amount of time I may be working or putting data into the system is very close to the total cycle time. The difference of that 10 minutes may be because I have to log into multiple systems to be able to input the data, or I need the system to give me a notification that it has received the application, and it's kind of a batch process. So that difference between touch time and cycle time is considered negligible and could be driven purely because of system-related constraints. The total volume, again, 70, not 100, because remember, I pulled out 30% of my application at this point in the process, so only 70 of them made it through, and ultimately I've got a head count of 10 for the same step again. This is when I was talking about relational analysis, being able to put in things into context. You can kind of see here, look, I've got a process that only processes 70 application, roughly has the same touch time as the previous step, but I've got the same number of headcount. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do I need to add more people here, or do I need to eliminate this not good in order to increase capacity? All of these wonderful conversations and points of analysis I will do in a whole separate video. This one was just purely focused on helping you determine the data points you should be compiling as you're documenting the process. Collect as much as you can. If it's anecdotal, if it's just word of mouth from the people that you're interviewing, collect it, because it's better than nothing. All right. Now let's move on to the next step where we're going to be talking about some nice to have data points to collect if you have exhausted all your options. So with the example out of the way, there are a few other data points that would be wonderful to have if you can get your hands on. Don't sweat it if you can't. Again, these are things that could take your analysis to the next level, but they're absolutely not mandatory. And those 3 additional data points are customer segments. So think about customer segments as maybe your process performs differently, or maybe you've designed a different process based on a region, based on a manufacturing facility, based on your customer type. Someone may have a tremendous amount of wealth, someone may not, and you may have designed different processes or different systems. So segmentation in general is a really good way of adding additional context or additional level of understanding to the data that you compiled. So the second thing that would be fantastic to get your hands on are artifacts that support the process. So if there's a communication that goes out to the client at some point in the workflow, get examples of that communication. Try to understand what's being explained to the customer at what point, to what level of detail. If people are developing their own templates or Excel spreadsheets to do particular calculations, collect those. If there are forms being used that are being given to the customer or internal forms that we are using to compile data, collect that. The more you understand about the process, the more powerful you will be in being able to understand the constraint points and the issues with the process. And the last thing, not least, in terms of data to compile, is the voice of the customer. So if there is a call center, collect whatever information you can from the call center. How often are people calling in? What are the typical reasons that they're calling in for? How long does it take us to resolve those issues? Are there any escalations? Are there any complaints about a particular product or service that we're offering? You could also talk to the people in the front, relationship managers, salespeople, to collect their voice. Essentially, it's a secondary source of voice of customer, but a voice of customer nonetheless, to understand how the customer is perceiving the process, the product or service that you are beginning to analyze and document. So those are the 3 additional data points. They will be fantastic to have, but they're not a showstopper for you in terms of being able to analyze your process. That's it, guys. I just wanted to make sure that we focused on not just the mechanics of process mapping, that's important, but a process map in its own is just a nice, pretty picture. The data is what actually provides the context, the information that allows you to compare the different steps, the different milestones, and help you gauge what needs to be fixed. I'm grateful you joined. Please leave your comments and questions below, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.